But make no mistake, if you want to know what, I mean, surely the murder of Mr. Rice and the solving of that crime was a big deal. Without that, there would have been no Rice. But this was every bit as significant a transition in my judgment. I'd like to mention a couple of smaller but critical building blocks that occurred early on. One was the emphasis on quality. Quality of faculty, quality of students, quality of campus. And if you start with the faculty, all I can say is Edgar Odell Levitt must have been one heck of a salesman. The people he persuaded to come down here, for example, to teach physics, he brought Harold Wilson from Cambridge, a very renowned scientist. For biology, Julian Huxley from Oxford, of the famous Huxley family. For English, Stockton Anson, Woodrow Wilson's brother-in-law from Princeton. For German, Lindsay Blaney from Heidelberg. For architecture, William Ward Watkin, who became, of course, a very famous architect. And if you think of the ones you've known over the years, Radoslav Sanoff, Floyd Lear, Asa Chandler, and on, I mean, if a school is known by the quality of its faculty, and I think in many ways it is, they got off to quite a start. And without that, it would have been very hard later on to catch up. I don't think the students were nearly as good as the faculty at that time because it was a new school, and the quality of the students has evolved and continues to evolve, so that when I was here compared to today, I can tell you it is night and day difference. Somebody told me the other day I probably couldn't get in there anyway, so but they had a great, and also I'd like to emphasize something seems less important, but I don't think it is, and that's the quality of the campus. I did not frankly realize till I came on the board how much work went into this campus, the quality of the buildings and all, but it is a great thing. They're still following the overall plan written in either 1909 or 1910, which hangs in the President's conference room, designed by Ralph Adams Cram, famous architect of the day. And to some extent, Rice has followed its own plan better than just about any university in the country. Caesar Pelli, famous architect, used to be head of the Yale department and a current advisor to Rice on the campus, says he always uses Rice as the example when he's talking to universities about how to handle their campus. Since we're talking about building blocks, I'd like to mention one thing out of turn because I really think it is a hugely important thing for this university. Something wasn't here when Peggy and I were in school, and that's the college system. If you walked out during a school day and stopped 20 students and you ask them, what are the best things about Rice? I suspect everyone I would mention the college system. Again, as John Bowles has said, it was the greatest single thing in improving student life here. It transformed, really, the undergraduate experience, and we're still working on it. If Weiss College, new Weiss, is going up now. Martell is going up over the other end of the campus, and we're making substantial additions to Jones and Brown, so that even when Weiss is torn down, the old Weiss, there will be an addition of about two full colleges. It's that important. And I think the other thing is the evolution of the college system to play a much larger role in the intellectual and cultural life of the students. It's very important now, but I'm convinced it can be even better. And it is a real deal. I think it is very distinctive to Rice. What we have is different than Princeton or Yale, and I think it can be better. But it's still evolving, but it's very, very important. Now let me move on to another subject, one that I feel is very, very important, but not for the reasons most people think it's important. And that is the decision in 1942 to acquire an interest in the Rencana Oil Field in South Texas. Let me give you some background to it. Roy Hoffines, the guy that pushed the Dome Stadium, was county judge. He was a Rice graduate. He had in his court a large estate that had a large interest in this oil field in South Texas. It needed to be sold. He conceived the idea that it would be best to sell it, it'd be more valuable to sell it to a nonprofit, i.e. Rice. So he got together George Brown and Harry Weiss, Brown of Brown and Root, Weiss of Humble Oil, neither of whom was on the Rice board at that time, and said, would y'all take this to the Rice board and persuade them to acquire this interest? I think it'll be a real good deal for them. They agreed. They went to the Rice board. They made their presentation. The board considered it and rejected it, which isn't too surprising because it's probably more recent than you might imagine that universities have invested in anything except some bonds and things like that. Also, it's important to know in a lot of ways, this was the end of the era for a Rice board, and a new one had to begin. Captain Baker, the longtime leader of the board, had died in 1941. Other trustees were nearing the end of their tenure on the board, the time they would be there. It was obvious that a major change was coming in the leadership from the board side of things. So, what did Brown and Weiss do? They pushed the board and said, if you don't think you have the authority, why don't you go to court and seek a declaratory judgment that you do? Finally, the board said, okay, we'll try. So they filed suit in district court, and they got a decision not only that they could buy that interest in the Rencana Oil Field, but they could make a whole wide range of investments. And that, in my judgment, was the main significance of that. Now, to be sure, the Rencana Oil Field was a gold mine for Rice. I mean, Rice was pretty poor at this time, having a very hard time doing what it needed to do. And over the next 3 decades, the Rencana Oil Field produced over $35 million. And in those days, that was real money, and it made a big difference. But it did not make as big a difference as this ability to make this wide range of investments. It's interesting, George Brown became chairman of the board in about late 40s, I guess. He, Harry Weiss, people like Gus Wortham pushed the university to much more aggressive management of the money. And set a tradition that that it has become, and it still is, a thing of enormous concentration at the board level, how to handle the investments. Think of it this way. In 1943, the entire Rice endowment was $17 million. 20 years later, 1963, it was worth about $100 million. Today, it's over $3.5 billion. What is the significance of making a more aggressive type investment over those years? Hundreds of millions of dollars. And I can tell you, people say, why is Rice able to do all the things it's doing? There are a lot of reasons, but you cannot ever discount the importance of the endowment. It is more important to Rice than an endowment is to any other university in the country. Any other university. About 40% of our operating budget revenues for the budget come from the endowment. It is really hard to imagine how that has gone. It's also true that concentration on it has led to this growth, because if you look at the top universities, top endowment schools, and how they've done over the years, Rice is certainly in the top 5% of the performance, and the difference between that and average is an enormous amount of money. So I would say that 1942 is significant. The Rencana Oil Field production was important, but really you had at that time a change of leadership that came into this school, and that led in a subtle way to just enormous improvement in this university's status. Probably the last historic thing I'd like to mention, and I'll do it very briefly, is the lawsuit filed in the early 60s to be able to charge tuition and to admit minorities. Frankly, the prohibition in the charter that agreed to the white children of Houston, Texas, I don't think was ever observed. It was treated as a Jim Crow law, as so much was true in the South in those days, because Asians and people from Latin America have been here before that lawsuit. But I will say this, that without that lawsuit, this university could never have moved forward. And I think and Melissa Kane is going to, Melissa Kane is going to speak. And incidentally, the desegregation of Southern universities is an important topic. And Melissa Kane, a very bright young woman who got her PhD here last year, wrote her thesis on this. It included Rice, Duke, Vanderbilt, Emory, and I don't know who else. And her thesis was so good that North Carolina Press is now, I understand, publishing it. Is that correct?
University of Georgia Press.
Oh, University of Georgia. So I recommend it to you whenever it comes out. It ought to be very good. Now, having said all that, I would like now to spend a little time on more current events. I suppose current events are not history, I understand it, so bear with me, and I'll just mention 3 or 4 things that we've been doing just the last 3 or 4 years. The first thing I'd like to mention, and Malcolm Gillis started it, David Austin, who's now president of Case Western, was instrumental in getting it going, and that was the development of the first comprehensive strategic plan, really in the history of this university. It took well over 2 years. It involved the entire faculty, the entire staff of the university, many alumni. We discussed it at every board meeting, and we also held 3 separate board retreats trying to come to grips with it before it was adopted. And it had effect to me, and people differ on this, how they look at it. I think it galvanized all the constituencies of this university. I think it pulled together people with a common vision. I say it's no longer what it was when we adopted it. It changes almost every day as you plan different things, but at least it provided a clear focus on the character of the university and what needed to be done to lift it to the next level, which was clearly its purpose. Where do we go? How do we move it up further from where it is now? The second thing, and it grew out of that, is this capital campaign to raise $500 million. And one thing that I'd like to emphasize about that is that the capital campaign grew out of the strategic plan. Sometimes you see the reverse. People decide, I think we can raise so much money, let's decide what we're going to do with it. Literally, the strategic plan provided the analysis of what it would cost, provided the amount we needed for the capital campaign. Of course, now it's not nearly enough, as you might gather, but we'll just have to see what we do about that. The third thing I'd like to mention is the restructuring of the Rice Board, which was approved by a court in 1998. When I came on the board, I asked for a copy of the bylaws. And I remember going home and reading and saying, I don't even have a vote. What was the situation? Go back to 1891. Mr. Rice provided that the university would be in the hands of 7 trustees who would serve for life and who would pick their own successors, and all of whom would live in Houston. Now, that's not exactly a national research university board, I'll tell you. In 1949, desperate to get help on the board, the trustees created the governor system. Remember, it used to be called the Board of Governors. Not anymore. But the governors, there were to be 2 a year with 4-year non-repeat terms. So you'd have more people coming on and off the board, but technically without a vote. Or really a right to participate beyond that. Then in 1968, I think, The Alumni Governor was created, 4 of them at any one time. And it worked pretty well, so you had a total of 19 with only 7 trustees, but it was really out of sync with what the best universities were doing. And so when I came chairman, we created a committee. Hank Hudspeth chaired it, and it did a lot. We pulled together an enormous amount of material, went to the West Coast, Stanford and Caltech and others, and went to the East Coast, visited with the universities there, and concluded that the current system was unacceptable. Filed a lawsuit. Well, first we had to go to the State Attorney General, who has supervision over these kind of trusts, and finally persuaded them to go along with us anyway, if not enthusiastically. And we finally went to court, had a hearing, and what we now have is the number of trustees increased from a maximum of 7 to 25. All trustees are alike. No one is on there for life. He's fixed with terms, and we eliminated any geographic requirement, except the State Attorney General insisted that at least half be from the state of Texas, and that's really not a problem. And so with that, we've been able to move toward, and we're not there quite where we want to be yet, but toward a more national board with a lot of different views and people, a lot of different backgrounds. And it's amazing, you do get a more varied opinions about everything, and I think as we move along, that will prove to be very important. The last item I would mention in these changes, and one that I thought would be hugely controversial. In fact, I was so worried about it that I had all sorts of compromises where we might do it. And that is the elimination of the prohibition of debt. And I knew people would say, well, you're going to run the school on the ground, with debt. What we did conclude in looking at it, that Mr. Rice may well have been right in 1891 to prohibit debt. The last quarter of the 19th century has been called a generation of depressions, with waves of bankruptcies and foreclosures. And you can see how fragile a new place like Rice, if it got too in debt, could have just gone under. But today, debt is a far different thing than it was in those days. Every business utilizes debt. And what it means is you pay as you use rather than pay as you build. What it means is you don't have to wait for all your pledges to be paid before you can do anything. But it means a lot more than that. It means a lot more than that. For example, we found that we were the only institution of higher learning in the United States of any sort that we could find that had this prohibition. We were severely disadvantaged in competing with the best schools in the country. And as we began to implement the strategic plan, we found that it simply was not economically feasible without debt. And let me tell you exactly what I mean. Over the last 30 years, the Rice Endowment has averaged just about 15% a year return. I wish I averaged that well, I might add. So when we used endowment money to build a building, we were using 15% money. In the last few years, we've been using 20-some-odd% money. Just imagine over a 30-year life of that building. Whereas as a nonprofit, we could borrow money, say 5.5%. You try paying the difference. What it meant was that if we were building a $50 million building, over the next 30 years, to do it with endowment funds would cost way over $100 million more. And we just couldn't afford it. The interesting thing about it to me, because I went into this with some trepidation, by the end of our discussions, there was not a single dissent on the board. In fact, I began to get calls saying, what in the hell are you doing? Why don't you get this thing off our backs? And we finally we never got the Attorney General to support us, but they didn't oppose us. And we got the court to enter the order. And what we're doing now, we put pretty severe restrictions on ourselves, the main one being that we want to keep the very highest credit rate of any university in the country. I think there are a few others that have the same rating, but that's sort of the test. And I figure if we do that, we're all right. Secretary Baker said that he knew where that prohibition came. It came from his grandfather, who hated debt. He said, but if he were here today, he would vote to take this to court and get rid of it. So I figured we were okay.